All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the October 24th meeting of the Ames Community School District Board of Directors. I will call the meeting to order and entertain a motion to approve the agenda. So moved.
Second.
Moved by Winfrey, seconded by Becker. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Passes 6-0. And we will now read our purpose statement, and we invite anyone in the room to read it along with us if you would like. The Ames Community School District commits to equity and access that empowers every individual to reach their full personal and educational potential. Thank you. The first item on our agenda tonight is a celebration and recognition of the Middle School Activities Director of the Year, Spencer Esslinger. And I'll turn it over to Director Amy DeLashman.
Good evening, everyone. We are here to celebrate Spencer Esslinger. Spencer, I'm going to read a couple of statements here. Unfortunately, neither of these individuals could be here tonight, but really wanted you to hear this information. So congratulations for the Iowa High School Athletic Directors Association Central District Middle School Athletic Director of the Year for 2022. The first statement is from Lyle Fetters, the Activities Director at Ames High School. It is my honor to write a letter of recommendation for Spencer Esslinger for the IHSADA Middle School Athletic Director of the Year. I have had the pleasure to work with Spencer for the past 2 years as the High School Athletic Director at Ames. Spencer is the Ames Middle School Athletic Director and has been in this position for 6 years. In addition to the responsibilities of the Middle School Athletic Director, Spencer teaches half-time. Spencer does a tremendous job of providing activities at the middle school that provide opportunities for all students. Ames Middle School had over 75% participation from its students this past year. Spencer works tirelessly to encourage students to participate in athletics, fine arts, and clubs. In addition to running the middle school activities department, Spencer helps at high school events with game management and supervision. He is willing to take on responsibilities that improve the activities department at the middle school and high school levels. Spencer was and continues to be a great resource for me as a new employee to the Ames Community School District. He made the transition between ADs seamless and strives to put the students at Ames first. Spencer is a great asset to the Ames Community School District and an exemplary middle school athletic director. His tireless work ethic, accountability, communication skills, and dedication make him one of the best middle school athletic directors in the state. And the next statement is from Ames Middle School Principal Jonas Michael. Jonas wasn't able to join us tonight either. Mr. Esslinger, there are a few among us who know all the work you've put in to make Ames a better place for our youth. You are present at every single middle school home game. I can attest to this. He is at every middle school home game. You find creative ways to fund extra and co-curricular activities that don't generate enough gate money to sustain their programs. You were instrumental in providing our 6th grade students more opportunities to engage in after-school activities by adding 6th grade intramural sports. And let's not forget the enormous amount of time you spent researching, advocating, and leading our athletics and activities safely through a global pandemic, all while carrying a full-time teaching load despite the fact that your counterparts within the CIML conference had full-time activities directors at the middle school level. It's rare to find someone who has achieved the same level of success as Mr. Spencer Esslinger, and yet continue to stay so humble and true to themselves. You do everything with great diligence, integrity, and energy. The dedication you have shown to the students at Ames Middle School and the Little Cyclone community as a whole have resulted in such a well-deserved achievement. I know this achievement is only one of many the future will bring. Congratulations, Spencer, for being named the 2022 Central District Middle School Activities Director of the Year. I'm so proud of you. Congratulations.
Well, I would just like to say that you have been such an asset at the middle school. And I have seen the difference having had kids who were older and kids who were younger with the sixth graders and having the opportunity to participate in the intramurals. I know that was a big undertaking at the time that you did it. And it's been just invaluable for the students. So we are really, really grateful to have you in our district. All right. We will go ahead and move on to our discussion items. And our first discussion item is our board committee update. We'll begin this evening with the facilities committee.
We spent quite a bit of time talking regarding the high school project, and there's some things that'll be coming up about that. Another thing kind of to point out is we continued the discussion with Director Peters and Superintendent Lawson about kind of path forward on how we do prioritization of projects to take into account the needs of students best and how we can be thinking about that going forward. And I know Dr. Lawson's working on some procedures related to that we'll be seeing in the future. So.
Great. Any questions or comments for the facilities committee? Equity committee.
The equity committee met. There'll be meeting minutes forthcoming. They're not in there. It's just the empty meeting minutes in there right now. So those will be coming out and those will be available next time.
Thank you. And policy committee.
We met last week, October 13th, and went through another chunk of policies, which we'll talk about in a second. And then our next meeting will be December 15th.
Questions or comments on board committee updates or any other updates from committees? Okay. And just make sure we don't have anyone signed up to speak under board committee updates. Okay. Then we will move on to the new Ames High School project cost update. And we'll turn it over to Director Jerry Peters.
For the opportunity to give you an update. We have a monthly report and meeting with the facilities committee. And so the facility committee has been kept up to date all the way along here. But I thought now that we've got to kind of a milestone in the project, as far as being able to open and occupy the building, it'd be a nice time to be able to update the full board. There's still some work to be done. I mean, I was thinking once we had the pool or the building open, then it would kind of slack down. But now we have 1,500 people to report the things that we need that need attention. So we are continuing inside the building to complete the punch list items. That work's going on. We're still working on the old building now. So we've got asbestos abatement that's been completed and we're gearing up for demolition. Part of the demolition process is disconnecting the utilities. We also need to be able to coordinate taking or disconnecting the stadium and then reconnecting it with new feeds from the new building. So then the demolition work's going to go on after that. We've also got bid issuance number 4 and bid issuance number 5 that we're working on. And bid issuance 4 is going to come up on the school board agenda here a little bit later for approval. That includes building a greenhouse where the existing building is now. And then we have a band platform and outdoor classroom. And then, so that's been bid, and so we're looking to be able to request for approval on that here with this meeting. And then bid issuance number 5 is going to do the practice fields and some fencing and some minor site improvements. So that will wrap up the entire project, and that's geared up to be completed around this time next year. I did pick up a couple of statistics here that we did. I don't know, they're kind of interesting, just numbers. We've had, as far as the paperwork and in the management of the project that Story has done and the architects and the contractors, there's been 815 proposal requests, 625 requests from information that contractors apply or send to the architect, 343 change requests, 325 material tests, 235 change orders. So that's really kind of the one I could have gotten away just by saying that. According to our electronic file management system, we've saved 147 trees within this project. So it's kind of interesting. We've had architectural supplemental instructions. There's been 87, and there have been 12 construction change directives. But overall, the project's been running pretty smoothly. I mean, we've survived the COVID, supply chain issues, some labor shortage. We've survived it, but it's still been a struggle, and we still continue to struggle with some of that. But with that, just want to kind of give that overview. I want to turn it over here to Dean McCormick with Story. He's been really the spearheading the project, and he's just been a great leader and a great asset to the team.
So what you have in front of you is a projected budget and cost looking forward to the end of the project. Jerry and I sat down a couple weeks ago and just tried to take a look at our crystal ball and say, where are we going to be a year from now? So what you see is a summary that lists the original budget. That's the budget we started out with in 2019, I guess, maybe before that. The current budget column there is a snapshot of where we sit today, right now. And then the far right, you've seen those columns before on reports. The far right column then is a projection of final costs. And Jerry mentioned that we have a recommendation to award issuance 4 on the agenda here later today. So the reality is that issuance 4 in all told bid about $1 million over the budget that we had set several years ago, about 3 years ago. As you probably know, the world, I guess, and certainly the construction industry has seen unprecedented escalation. And that's reared its ugly head and kind of bit this project at the end. So as we looked at issuance number 4 bidding over, and we assume that will be awarded tonight at the bid cost, we're projecting now that we'll be about $500,000 over the project budget when it's all said and done. So we've accomplished a lot with that budget. As for you that have been around from the beginning, or remember that in 2019, we made a lot of decisions to defer a number of equipment items. On bid day, we incorporated many of those into the project we were able to. And then as we've moved along, I think we've made decisions to purchase some of the deferred equipment as we've moved along. I've listed at the bottom here some of the items that have been purchased. I think those are prudent decisions and probably represented good value to purchase those during the construction process and incorporate them into the process as we've moved along. Unfortunately, as we've come down to the end, we've gotten closer and closer. We sort of got bit by the inflation bug. And so that's kind of where we're going to end up. I think the decisions were made along the way were all prudent given the information we had. But we just wanted to report that it looks like we're going to come in slightly over the budget when it's all said and done. So
with that then too, we on a big project or on all projects, we want to kind of track or keep our eye on the change orders, the percentage of change orders. And when we look at that percentage of change orders, where we're at right now, did you have that?
total?
Yep.
Yeah, about 3.5%.
3.5%. And of that 3.5%, half of that at least is the owner directed changes that we've done and we've infilled, through the past. So we're down to less than 2% for total change orders on a $137 million project. That's really a great achievement. And that goes to design. It goes with the application or the construction process too. Some of the change orders are a result of design deficiencies or scope issues. So in other words, it just wasn't covered in the documents. I mean, a huge project like this, it's likely, it's common that that's going to happen. Others are owner discretion type of things. And what other, you have a couple categories for that, right?
And Jerry, that 2%, if I remember right, at the beginning, we allocated 4%. So you came in half of what we budgeted
Yes.
for the change orders.
Yeah. And so with that, when we started out, we had a contingency. And that contingency is where, as we move through the project, that's a placeholder for the things that we didn't anticipate, unforeseen conditions, additional scope that was added. And one of the things, let me talk about the scope. You know, when we add scope to the work that wasn't included in the budget, then quite often we'll want to be able to increase the budget for that scope. So we didn't do that along the way. So the things that we we're able to include some things in the project that were an increase in scope. And so as we work through the project then, and we keep an eye on the contingency, we start absorbing that contingency. So the goal is to start off with the contingency at the beginning, but when we get to the end of the project, our contingency is zero because it gets absorbed within the construction to be able to pick up those items that we didn't include when we were first dreaming about this project 4 or 5 years ago.
So would it be accurate to say kind of the summary is we had a $137 million project through COVID, supply chain, labor shortages, and we added $2 million of extra stuff to it. And we came out 0.4% above the budget compared to other projects I've heard that are going massively, massively over right now. So I think you guys did awesome. I mean, that
We've been really fortunate, I think, just the way things have been working out for us. And then, you know, putting together a great team. I can't shortchange that at all. We just been at a phenomenal team.
I think the only thing I would maybe adjust on the adding of the extras, that was pulling things from our deferred list. So when you look at the things that we pulled in, they weren't new ideas that came along that, oh, we should do this and we should do this. It was things from what I recall. I mean, some of them they were learned that, you know, we learned in the process that this would be a better fit for this facility or help it be a better, you know, efficiencies or things, but they weren't just a bunch of ideas that came along. They were things that we had deferred at the time to make sure that we met the budget in 2019. I'm correct in that?
Yeah, I would
Okay.
agree. I would agree with that assessment. The vast majority of the costs have gone to things that we were aware of and deferred at the time. Of course, we've made adjustments to design, to room configuration, added outlets in this all the way along. So there's an element of that throughout this too, but the vast majority of this has been invested in items that add value to the final project.
Any other questions?
All right.
Thank
Thank you both for giving us that update. Okay. Our next item is our policies for discussion.
So I'll just say in a nutshell, these are largely format updates, some aligning with IASB that weren't, but very minor changes. Is there any? I don't think there were any that were significant differences from the previous. So if there's questions, concerns.
Okay, I don't see any questions. We don't have anyone signed up to speak under this topic. So we will move on to teaching and learning, which will be our instructional improvement strategy. And we'll turn it over to Director Miller.
Good evening. Thanks for having me here this evening. We're going to talk just a little bit, in case folks weren't able to attend the work session last time. We talked about our ISASP results, and then we kind of started talking at the end about, so now what, right? So we have these ISASP results. Now what do we do? So I wanted to talk with you a little bit about what that looks like at the district level. So what happens after we get results like this? So we'll talk through a few different things tonight, and I'll try to pause along the way. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to interrupt. So there we go. We just kind of talked last time about our ISASP results. And this is when you boil it down to what's the district overall percentage of proficient or advanced in the three categories. This goes back it goes back actually 4 years, but you'll remember that we didn't get a score in the 1920 year because we didn't test that spring. And so you'll see the pattern over time, and the most recent results in ELA, we had 73% of students either proficient or advanced, in math 71%, and in science 70%. So when you see scores like that, you've heard me talk, and I'll talk a little bit more this evening as well about sort of that idea that if 80% of our students across groups are meeting our proficiency, then our system can probably handle intervening around the remaining 20%. We know that some kids will need different things, right? And if we're not at 80%, then we need to look at what we call tier 1, which is the universal instruction, which is what does everybody get, right? So tier 1 is a really big, messy thing. And where do you start is really the interesting question. So I wanted to do a little bit of an overview first about a researcher, an educational researcher named John Hattie, who you may be familiar with and you may not be. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background just in case, but he's somebody that spends a lot of time compiling meta-analyses. So he looks across lots of different studies to find out not only what works in education, but what works best. Because the good news is lots of things we do work, right? They help students learn. But if we really want to accelerate learning and push students forward, we really want to look at strategies that might help students make more than a year's growth of educational gains in a year's time. We want to be more efficient and be able to accelerate learning in that way. So when he's looking at different things that might affect student learning, he has kind of the barometer of desired effects, so to speak. And so you can see starting if it's a negative number, right, that's actually doing harm to student learning. So that has the potential to really reverse learning. And the good news is there's not a lot of things that in his research he's found that really reduce student learning, right? Then you have a zone called developmental effects, which is sort of the equivalent of getting a year older, right? So if something has, when we look at these things, you'll see an effect size. You'll see a number, right? So if you see a number that's between 0.0 and 0.2, it's about the equivalent of kids getting a year older, right? So it's maybe not anything that we did that made a big impact. Your typical teacher effects will be between about a 0.2 and about a 0.4. Okay, so that's just being in class with a teacher in the year. And where you start to get into that zone of desired effects is what he calls it, is at the 0.4. So that's the hinge point where he's saying that's the equivalent of a year's growth. And so anything above a 0.4 is going to get you more than a year's growth when you're talking about student learning. So of course, we want to think about what might be in that zone of desired effects. And so we'll go through a few factors for you just generally this evening so you can kind of get a sense of what falls in which area. And then we'll talk a little bit more specifically about where we're focusing our work as a district. Okay, so you might expect that in the negative effects, social media use is one of the few things that they've studied that actually does have the potential to slow down student learning quite a bit. So that should have a negative sign on it. So I apologize, but that's a negative 0.07 on social media. So if you're wondering like, gosh, what are these effects? They're really interesting to look at, but social media is something that if we can figure out ways to limit or only use in productive ways, right, then kids might learn more efficiently. A typical developmental effect, they did some research on student personality, and does student personality have any effect on learning? And not very much, right? Just in that 0.10 effect size. You might remember, I encountered these when I was at Iowa State, but where you have the clickers to give a response in the big lecture hall, right? That how much does that accelerate learning? And that was a 0.24. So that's in the average teacher developmental effects, but it's not accelerating student learning. It's not hurting anything, right? That's one of those strategies that why might we invest a lot of time and energy when it's really not an effective strategy? One thing that we've been on, as some of you know, our district's journey around word study and decoding and phonics instruction. Phonics instruction is one of those things that has a higher effect size than a 0.4. It's a 0.57. So that gets us more than a year's growth if we're really focused at the word level, right? And we've kind of been through that journey as district. Another thing that we've been talking a lot about with folks is the idea of classroom discussion, where you're talking about the content with someone other than the teacher, right? Sometimes we think about whoever's doing the talking is also doing the thinking and the learning. So that is held up in this research study that it's an effect size of 0.82, which Hetty has said is like double a year's growth, right? So that's a really high effect size. So the old idea of thinking about we want silent classrooms kind of goes out the window with this, right? We want to hear kids talking and engaging and learning. And then the one we're really going to focus in on through various ways this evening is something that he calls collective teacher efficacy. And as you can see there, it's way off the chart, right? It's a 1.36. So that's the belief and the trust in each other as a system. That I'm going to trust you, that you are very highly effective in your role, and you're going to trust me, and we're going to work together, and we can change student outcomes, right? So the biggest effect sizes that are in this study are almost all teacher effects, right? So not a lot of factors about students. Teachers matter more, and good instructional practices matter more than anything that might be like demographic things or program things or anything like that, right? These are things that matter quite a bit, the teachers. So you'll see that in our plans. When we think about ISASP and thinking about how to respond to data and results, we're really thinking about how can we support our teachers to do their best work with our students. Any questions about Hattie? I'll pause. Yes.
Sorry, this is just about collective efficacy, but
No worries.
I mean, sorry, I, as a social scientist,
Yeah.
I read a fair amount about efficacy. It strikes me that there's a chicken and egg question here. Collective efficacy is probably higher in successful systems, right?
I would have to read more about it, but yes, I think there's kind of like as we experience success, then our collective efficacy grows, right?
Right.
So how can we have those successful moments? Because when you read into like, how do you build collective efficacy? A lot of it is through those small, yes. So how do we keep having those small wins? How do we experience more success so that we can trust each other to do our best jobs? Yeah.
So it's not just you go out and give people motivational speeches and then there's suddenly the system.
Right. Yep, absolutely.
Good,
Yep,
okay.
yep. But as you have experience with, like, let's say the one before it was classroom discussions, right? So as we have experience with classroom discussions and we see the impact on learning, then our efficacy grows. And if I'm seeing you're doing it and I'm doing it, we're all doing it together, then our effect is magnified, right? Yeah. Okay. So I want to get back then. So I wanted to frame it. One of the things that we've been sharing with teachers as we've been doing some learning in buildings this year is around Hattie's work. So I wanted you to have that same frame as we get into the rest of the presentation. So when we think about system level improvements, the state of Iowa has asked us to think about our multi-tiered systems of support. So you remember that acronym MTSS, right? And then they ask us each year to do a self-assessment of that. So how are we doing with our multi-tiered systems of support? That's called the SAMI. That's how we affectionately refer to it because we love our acronyms. So when we do the SAMI, we think about 5 healthy indicators of a successful MTSS system. So the very first thing is our leadership team. So we do a reflection. So each building does this with their leadership teams, and they go through a protocol that asks them to think about how is their leadership around MTSS and where might they have strengths and where might they need to make improvements. We look at the arrangement of assessment and database decision making. So what assessments are available to us? Are they giving us the information we need? And then are we able to make instructional decisions as a result of those assessments? We look at universal instruction, which again, that's that global tier one piece. So as we're thinking about tier one, is it meeting the need of 80% of our kids? And are we meeting the needs of our kids within demographic groups or program groups, right? Like all those things we go through. We look at our intervention systems. So that's tier two and tier three. So if a student doesn't meet the expectations, how are we going to support them? Or if a student comes in already knowing, how do we push their learning further, right? So you think about that both sides. And then you think about the infrastructure. So the resources, the time, the things that folks need, do we have those things in place for a really good tier one system? So so this last June, the building teams met and they went through this whole series of protocols around these different categories. And then they were able to prioritize which one of these things do we most need to work on in order to improve instructional outcomes in the district. So when they do this, I should say they look at three big areas. They are asked to think about these things in the lens of reading. They're asked to think about these things in the lens of math, and then also in social, emotional, behavior, mental health. Since we talked about ISAS last time, I'm just going to talk about reading and math tonight, and I'll stay at that. What did the buildings have in common across the system level? So we're talking about reading. When we look at our ISAS results, you'll remember last time that we have outcomes that we're not yet satisfied with, right? We have disproportionate outcomes across demographic groups and across program groups. So when we're looking at these things, we really want to think about who's benefiting and who's not benefiting from our instruction. So when you get across all of the different building groups, there were two areas that really stood out that we really wanted to tackle as a district team. So one of those things was around leadership. How can we be more effective in leading MTSS work as a system? And the other that stuck out in reading was around universal instruction. So we have those two pieces that we've been working on. And you've seen over the last couple of years, and especially last spring, we had some additional curriculum review pieces at the secondary in universal instruction and reading. So you can kind of see some of these action steps flow through time. When we're thinking about leadership, we're thinking about universal instruction, there's a really nice intersection between those two pieces. So again, the state of Iowa has some protocols when you're looking at universal instruction. What should you be looking at to see what's working and what's not and for whom? So there's 6 building blocks of instruction, universal instruction that we talk about. So one is instructional time and opportunities. Do we have the required amount of time in our schedule? Who has access to it? Who doesn't? What might be getting in the way? We think about the enacted curriculum, which the state is defining here as our standards. So are we teaching to the standards? Do teachers have the support they need to know and deeply understand the standards? 3 is our instructional practices. So again, that ties back to like Hattie's research, right? And are we using high leverage instructional practices in our classrooms? 4 is instructional materials. Do we have high quality instructional materials that meet the teacher's needs? Do we have the right assessments for learning, and are we able to get useful data from those? And then what sort of collaborative supports do we have in that content area? So this is literacy, since we're talking about that. But those are not only within like PLCs and groups of teachers coming together, but how are we working collaboratively with families? How are we working collaboratively with community partners, right? Lots of things fall under that umbrella in order to make a really strong tier 1. So we're helping building leadership teams, thinking about which areas of these things do they already really have strong in the building, which ones do we want to improve, and how might we go about that? So when we think about creating action plans, the 6 building blocks of universal instruction are kind of our key rocks there as we go on. Then when we think about supporting teachers, I kind of talked about there's another side of it, right? So we have to think about increasing our professional learning supports for staff. And we think about a few different things. How do we know ourselves? How do we know our students? And what are the instructional practices that improve student learning? So we have 2 big areas that we're working on there. You've heard me talk about the core teams before, but we have one core team really digging into the Danielson framework for teaching. And that's really looking at the 4 categories. I know they're really hard to read. Talk about planning and preparation, our learning environments, our learning practices, and then our principal teaching, which is how do we show up as teachers, right? So we have a group of folks learning about that this year, so we can keep moving that work forward. And then the other thing I selected on there as a representative of our diversity, equity, and inclusion learning that we're doing with our staff this year was just this idea of the culture tree. So when we're thinking about how do we roll out Danielson, how do we make this match our students' needs, we have to think about how we show up in our spaces and what levels of culture we might want to think about. That's some learning our staff is doing right now around that when we're thinking about reading instruction. So before I go into math, do you have any questions about reading? Okay, I'll go into math. All right, so when we're talking about improving instruction in math, you see similar patterns across our demographic and program groups that we are not yet at 80% of our students where tier 1 is serving their needs. So we had the similar results from the SAMI that universal instruction popped up and leadership popped up. And that makes some amount of sense to us because if we think about our recent history in the district, we spent a lot of time talking on reading. And so we need to continue to improve support for staff in math. And so that has led us into launching a curriculum review for universal instruction in math. So I'll just talk a little bit about the curriculum review, sort of our 2 to 3 year plan around that, just briefly. So this year we've had core teams of teachers meet, PK-12, to talk about establishing a vision and what are the best practices in math instruction. And if we're trying to improve math instruction, really where should we be focusing our energy? They're also studying something called the coherence map. So when we're thinking about how do we get students ready for algebra in their freshman year, because we know algebra and algebra 2 are significant gatekeepers into college, right? And into careers. How do we get them ready for that? Our data is telling us not a lot of our students are algebra ready by 9th grade. So how do we shift that? When you're thinking about the standards for math, there's actually an intentional story of algebra readiness that is told through the standards. So one of the things the teachers have been studying is what is that story of algebra readiness? Where are we doing well already? And where might we want to shift some things so that we can better align to that coherence map? This is something that's come out since our last curriculum review. So we're learning new things and hopefully being able to think about how this might show up in our spaces. By the end of the year, our goal is to finalize a rubric to evaluate our materials that would include an equity rubric that centers representation and multiple ways of knowing. Centers best practices, research-based instructional practices in mathematics, and then also those standards that tell that story of algebra readiness, right? So how do we create a rubric that will help us select really good materials? That would launch us into the 23-24 school year, where basically we're trying to figure out what are we going to use as a resource. And then in the 24-25 school year, implement a new set of materials in mathematics. So that's our current overview of our big action plans in improving math instruction.
Erin, on the slide before,
Yes.
you talked about finalizing your rubric to evaluate materials. How was that similar or different from the rubric that you put together when you were looking at some of our other materials?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the equity rubric is pretty constant across those,
Okay.
right? So that's the one that we talk about. When we think about equity in curricular materials, I think most folks' first mind goes to, or at least mine used to go just to representation. Like we need lots of books that look in lots of different ways, but we don't think about there's lots of different ways to show that you know and understand something. So if we're only centering materials that show that you have to write everything down, for example, right? Versus how are there lots of different ways to show that I know answers to questions? So those things look different in different materials, but the language of the equity rubric kind of remains constant. And then each rubric has a section around best practices and around the standards. But so the categories are the same, but the teams develop, like in mathematics, what are the best instructional practices right now? So, and then we, like last year, we had in social studies, what are the best social studies methods? And then the standards that we really want to prioritize. There's a lot of standards. So we want to make sure we find a set of materials that emphasizes what we believe needs to be emphasized. So that's the standards category is again the same, but of course the content will shift.
One question looking at this slide. So you're talking about developing the best practices, a coherence mapping, all of that, how to get better at teaching math. But then if you go to the next slide, it looks like it's all focused towards getting the materials to then the next year have teachers improve with those new. There's like a 3-year gap after we decide, hey, there's better ways we could do it before we're through. Are you going to have a parallel path to like start using some of the new methods?
Yeah,
or
that's-
start refining what we're doing now.
Yeah, that's always
It's
the
not about
tension, right?
materials.
Yeah, so we had this came up in we had the core team of teachers has met a couple times, so we are able to get them subs still, so that's really exciting, and be able to meet with them. And a teacher said the same, but I know this now, can I change what I'm doing, right? Can I change some things? And we said, yes, of course, and our goal is to start to talk about, so there's something called the standards for mathematical practice that can be applied in lots of different content areas, so we can start learning about that before we get the new materials. And start to try to tweak some of the things we're doing. I think the caution, especially at the elementary level, is we're going to ask them to implement ruler next year. And so we try to stagger these things. So we're not asking them to learn lots of different sets of materials all in one year, because as you know, they teach everything. All of our elementary teachers teach everything. So it may be that we get to a point where we're able to talk about a different or a faster timeline for the secondary, because those folks are just teaching math for the most part. I don't say just in a slight way, but they don't have the other implementation responsibilities.
If I remember right from some data we looked like maybe a year or two ago in our district, it's kind of at that secondary level that kids start falling off track for math a little bit more. So that's an area I'm guessing you're concentrating on anyway.
Yes. Yep.
So you're saying that individual teachers may start changing math instruction practices as early as this year, but it sounds like the system as a whole will not be really working on making system-wide changes for another couple of years.
Yeah, I would say that's fair. We don't have an implementation expectation for the folks on the core team for this year. This is a learning year. So, but when you're thinking about the mathematical practices, so I'll give you an example. One of them is that they persist in their problem solving, right? So there's ways to support students now, because those are our current standards for mathematical practice. These aren't new. They're just something we maybe don't always emphasize, right? So we might think about how can we do that well now as with our current materials, and then how can we find us that if that's a mathematical practice, we say that's a key one, we want to find support for this, then how do we support folks, and how do we find a set of materials that really help support folks in persisting in problem solving, just for an example. So there you won't see different core resources, you won't see different materials that teachers on the core team are using than not, but just thinking about what kinds of opportunities and instructional support can we give students will happen faster maybe than a whole new set of tier 1 materials.
So your presentation about literacy focused on supporting building leadership and supporting teachers. Are those the things the areas where we're really focusing this year? I didn't quite understand what we're focusing on this year.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I would say yes. So one of the things, so maybe I can give a couple examples and maybe that will help. One of the things that we're really working on with our elementary folks, right? So we have a reading and writing units of study implementation plan, and we have foundations as a decoding word study set of materials, right? And so instructional coaches are offering either optional training or building level professional learning plans still on how do we get better at implementing those pieces of curriculum that we already have. So there's those things that are going on. I was trying to stay at what is the teaching and learning team doing, that sort of thing. And our work really is more with the leadership and then trying to support the professional learning for folks. But there are very specific things going on at the building. So we had another example from the middle school. We got a new set of materials last spring spring that we're starting this fall. And they had sub days this last week on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and they each met, did a couple of learnings with the folks from the company that supports that, and we're able to do some planning around the new materials and how are they implementing those and how's that going. So there's ongoing really specific things like that that we're helping to support, but this was kind of the high level overview from what my team is doing a little bit more of.
So I'm going to oversimplify.
That's totally fine.
As we look at all of the data that we looked at at the work session last time and that you reviewed this time, we're saying that as a district that we think the best way to address those issues are focusing on leadership and universal instruction.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay.
Yep.
And so what I'm hearing then there are specific teacher development related activities going on across the different schools. And I guess for the students that are not proficient, interventions are our current method of helping those students. Is that right?
Yes, both at the whole classroom level. So sometimes we're noticing that a whole class might need extra support, or we might not be able to access, let's say, the third grade standard yet. So when we get to this essential standard around, let's say, the fourth grade standards around summary, but we know we're not quite yet able to pick out the main idea. So we're going to go back and do an intervention around main idea to launch that summary learning forward, right? So there's some things that are going on because we're noticing this whole class level that we need to back up and pre-teach, maybe, to think about it that way. And then there are for sure individual or small groups. So that's what in that intervention system, tier 2 and tier 3 happening. And there's learning happening. So there's an elementary project right now about something called the press manual. And that's just a book that kind of describes some different fluency interventions that teachers might use with either small groups or bigger groups or individual students. So they're still learning there's still learning going on, and we are absolutely still providing interventions. That's just a smaller, I think, not quite the emphasis, right? We can't tackle all 5 parts of the graphic in an efficient way. So I think thinking about how do we meet individual students' needs while we're changing the system is a good way to think about it. Okay. Yep.
I think this is a question probably that'll be in a different presentation in the future, but
Okay.
the question following up on what Kelly said, for me is, how do we know we're succeeding? I mean, I'm with you on your judgment of this is what you guys think is best, but having some sort of pattern, I think Dr. Lawson has talked about it as like a pattern of data or a rhythm of data, just to understand, are we doing okay? So we don't have postmortem evaluations. Having some understanding of that at some point in the next couple months to the board, I think would be helpful. So we know what to expect to see as you're progressing and doing this. So.
Okay, very good.
Yeah. I think that's what I'm left with that. So in 3 years, we'll know if what we're doing is helping students. And so there's that gap of what about the students that are there now? And are we wasting our time? Like, if this isn't working, when are we going to know?
Yeah.
And I guess that's a fair question. How do we know in a year and a half if the path we're on is the right path?
Right. So I think there's some different layers of success criteria. The hardest thing to move is this standardized test data, right? But if we're thinking about, if you go back to that, there's 2 maybe ways to think about it. One, we give universal screeners 3 times a year. So we have fall, winter, spring. So we can kind of see from that, we know where they started. Are we making growth, right? So there's, and buildings have data days every time those come out. And some buildings have them more often, kind of to speak to your data cycle, where they say, okay, who's falling out? Why are they falling out? What do we need to do to respond instructionally? And we could bring in some principals to kind of share some of how they do those things. It's pretty impressive, actually. And so that's absolutely could be a future topic for for however we want to do that. But and then you think about even at the standard level, what are the classroom assessments? So when we think of that red assessments for learning box, right? We think at the board table, a lot of times we discuss this like big ISASP summative, but teachers are looking at the standard level assessment and what evidence do I have that the student is learning? And if I don't, how can I reteach and reteach until I'm able to show that the student is learning? So looking at things like progress reports or there's some buildings that have their essential standards. I've seen very elaborate spreadsheets where they have their standards and they have which students have already met the standard, which students haven't yet. How do we pull them into small groups? So a lot of that work is happening just not at the ISASP level because it doesn't always provide timely information to get those results about how is this working for our kids.
But wouldn't we see, so if we were doing, now I know we're doing some new things now, but wouldn't we have seen a change in those trends, the trend of those scores, if those, 3-time assessments were being used successfully to?
We
course
do
correct?
see increase from fall to spring typically.
Right.
But I get your point. So I think that's really difficult, partly because the way in which, if you think about our current assessment trend line, we gave it once before COVID, and then you had a big shift in the test. So we saw the old test Iowa assessments was really surface level, multiple choice kind of a thing. And so then that next year, when we had a much more rigorous test, we saw a decline in our scores. And then we had a complication of COVID happening, right? So then we have another year after that, which is, I don't know when it's fair to say COVID's no longer a factor. But when you think about that, and then you layer in that we had a new set of materials at the elementary level, most of the research on implementing new materials says you'll see a dip in your first year or two, and then you'll see an increase. So all of those factors layered in with a new test, and we only have 3 data points. So that's where it's really hard to put all of our success criteria in ISASP becomes really challenging. So I think we definitely could do a better job on what are the success criteria and how are we making progress towards those things.
So a suggestion I would make to the board, because I feel like as a board, we have had discussions around this data cycle and how do we understand, because I don't know how many people said to me when we were in the ISASP discussion, well, this is a dipstick, right? Okay, yes, we know this is a dipstick, but in our oversight role, how do we understand throughout the school year how things are going? That is an area of improvement for this board that I think Dr. Lawson, I would encourage you as you're thinking through how can we high level, how can you help us to understand how things are going, understanding all of these things that you're saying, because they are so very true about all of these things that we've added and these disruptions we've had, all of these things, some out of our control, some not. But what is a way this year that we can say, hey, board, you'll know January and you'll know May, or what is it in our planning that we can say intentionally, this is how we're going to have a high level understanding of how things are going and how you are making mid-year adjustments to help our kids. Obviously, you want to see the growth in the ISAS, but how could we understand it throughout the year?
Yeah. And I think that a lot of our discussion of our curriculum, I have a good sense of new things we're doing and what we're doing, but whether or not it's working is a mystery. So that would be very helpful.
Yeah, I want to reiterate something that I think was implicit in what both of them said, which is that I think we often don't see a connection between data and strategy. I think that that's basically what they're both asking for, is we've got a lot of data and we have some strategies. We're not sure which data correspond to which strategy and what the cycle is between these. So I think we need a clearer sense of, you can throw lots and lots and lots of numbers at us, many of which don't look particularly satisfying, but we don't know which ones we should be focusing on and how they're related to a strategy that's being implemented in the near term. And then how to assess whether that near term strategy is
Got it.
showing anything.
And I think one thing I would add on is we obviously don't want to add any additional work on top of what's already going to be getting done. So I know in talking to Dr. Lawson several months ago, there were some strategies he was talking about of methods that he'd be using to look at things and how they're going. So probably leveraging something like that. I mean, I trust Dr. Lawson on how he thinks is a good way to look at this and understand it. And just having a way we can also understand how that works as well.
Well, and I'd say, I would assume that it wouldn't be additional work to be assessing whether or not what we're doing is working, right? That should already be being done. It would be sharing
Yeah,
with
it'd be
us.
like the reporting method
Yeah.
and things like I wasn't trying to suggest, hey, give us a quarterly report that's some new
Yeah.
report. No.
I'm thinking back to that work session where we talked about lag and lead measures. I don't know, that one
Yeah.
stuck with me a lot. So what are our lead measures so that we know that this thing we're doing, that we're investing time and money and making teachers learn, how do we know that that's getting us somewhere as it's happening, even if it's not showing up in ISAPs for a while, but we can see that in classrooms that things are shifting.
Yes.
We're seeing more improvement this year than last year, doing it this way, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful given just the concerns overall and wanting to have a better understanding of how things are going to look at additional assessment data beyond ISASP, just to give us a sense of, as has been said, how things are going throughout the year.
Absolutely.
And I should also say, thank you for the presentation because I do love the idea how you took, hey, we've seen this data. This is what we're doing from. And I think Amy Erica asked that question at the last work session, which was perfect. We don't need to react to the data. You guys tell us what you think the data means and what you're doing. And that's the part that we just want to see and then understand how it's going. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions for Director Miller? Okay. Thank you. And we do have a community member sign up to speak under this discussion item. So Monique Finken, if you'd like to come up.
Good evening, Monique Benkin, 4810 Dover Drive. I'm actually speaking as an individual tonight, not as part of any group. I didn't plan to speak tonight, but then I took all these notes. I was like, I'm probably going to want to say something. So I want to start by saying my comments are not directed at Director Miller. I love Director Miller. Where's she? Good job tonight. That was really good. So, but I want to give you some feedback and I want to leave you with some questions, right? So I have been involved coming to these meetings for 6 years. That's how long I have been focused on the disparities, right? These data that we've seen, right? So what I want to share is that I feel like I'm pretty smart. I served on the board for 4 years. I do this work at my own job. I didn't understand anything. I felt the presentation was vague. I felt it was abstract. It was really confusing. I don't know what the plan is. I still don't know. So it's a difficult task that you all have, but when you're trying to communicate to the community, it needs to be understandable. Because when you have a presentation with words that aren't clear, not all of them are yours, right? Some of them are coming from the state, like I wrote it down somewhere. What did you call it? In the 6 building blocks, right? I was like, what are those things? Like an enacted curriculum. I don't know what that is, but I know that's not your words. But when you have a presentation filled with all of that ambiguity, it just starts to sound like buzzwords. And eventually it sounds like gobbledygook and it sounds like you don't know what you're doing. And so I would just encourage you to try to explain to us what you're doing. I think it's also important to stop blaming COVID, to stop blaming buying new curriculum, to stop blaming transitions in leadership. These numbers have looked like this from the 6 years that I've been here and before I got here. So I don't want to hear we only have 3 data points. That's not true. It's important that we not be disingenuous in this conversation, right? We know what's going on here and what we need to fix. The other thing I would say is that it was not clear how this works at the different levels. Certainly how you implement this at elementary is different at high school. That was not clear. It seemed to have the all students approach that we know doesn't work. I didn't see the targeted focus on students who remain in the disparities. I don't know what the goal is. To just say we're going to improve or be better is actually not a goal. So are you looking for statistical significance? Are you looking for this much percentage to be higher? What is the goal? What's the timeline? Again, I appreciate Director Beerbaum asking that question. 3 years? I mean, come on. And then what's the accountability here? And then the last thing that I would leave you with is this idea about, actually, it's not the last thing. I want to also say part of my problem is I've heard all this before. A lot of this stuff you're talking about is stuff we're already doing. And as Director Winfrey said, it's clearly not working. So to have that, we're going to align to the standards. We're going to do, I can't read my writing. Oh, the whole class interventions. We've been doing those things and we keep getting the same results. So I guess I feel like it feels disingenuous and really not useful. The last thing I will say is this idea of an equity rubric, which is a great idea, but the fact that the district doesn't have a director of equity, again, makes it feel really disingenuous. This stuff is complicated and confusing. And if there's not, we can't even invest in one person to lead the work. It makes you wonder, how are we ever going to get ourselves out of this mess? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Monique. Okay. I don't have anyone else signed up under our discussion items. So I will go ahead and open our public forum and we'll read our statement on public comments. Residents of the district, students attending the district, parents or guardians of students attending the district, and district staff members may address the board about any topic relevant to the district, whether on the current agenda or not. Those who wish to speak must sign up at the beginning of the meeting. Speaker participation is limited to 3 minutes once per item. The views and opinions of citizens addressing the board do not necessarily reflect those of the board, district administration, or staff. Speakers are to remember that Iowa law prohibits the board from discussing specific employees, students, or their performance. Student speakers will state their name and school. Others will state their name and address. And first we have Ryan Jeffrey.
Hello, Ryan Jeffrey, 234 Parkridge Circle, class of 98. I'm here to speak in support of naming the high school auditorium after Wayne Hank Hansen. So I'll just read what I've written here. Hank was a truly brilliant teacher, director, and friend. As someone who, shall we say, didn't connect easily with teachers, I was drawn to Hank immediately, and he became one of my favorite teachers from the first play my freshman year. In no small part due to him, I was involved in every play during my 4 years of high school, all of them working on crews, most of them on stage. I ran the scenery crew for 2 years and made sure I had room in my schedule for his classes. Over 4 years of working with Hank, he became the only teacher I would call a friend. When the last play of my senior year and Hank's last play before retirement came around, he decided to go out with one last piece of Shakespeare, A Midsummer Night's Dream. During tryouts, he came by to ask me what part I would love to play. I immediately said Puck, my favorite role in all of Shakespeare. I didn't think much of it. I'd never had a major role before. And I was pretty much content with bit roles as a scenery kid. But the next day came around and the cast list showed up, and there was my name next to Puck. It was in part trust and part reward for being completely dedicated to theater for those 4 years. And in turn, I rewarded that by giving him everything I had for that show. That's what Hank did. He gave people a space and the reason to give something their all. As that year came to a close, I graduated and Hank retired. I told people then that I hoped someday to have the resources to have the high school build a new auditorium and name it the Wayne Hank Hansen Auditorium. Well, you've all built that auditorium. It's beautiful. It's fantastic. Turns out the only resource that it really needs is more voices to support naming it after Hank. So please grant this honor to the memory of the man who made high school a better place for so many of us over the decades.
Thank you, Ryan. Judy Brown.
That was so nicely said. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for another opportunity to read a tribute on behalf of Wayne Hansen and naming the auditorium. So tonight I'm reading one that is from Heather Alexander, class of 1993. I was never much of a sports kid, but I loved the idea of having a team and a coach and was little jealous that my brother and friends had practices to go to all the time. They always seemed to make a lot of friends and have a good sense of community. So when I got to high school, instead of joining a sports team, I joined the theater team. And Hank found my coach and found my coach and community. Hank fostered the same sense of teamwork to create something bigger than ourselves in a way that I had not known before. He taught us how to act, build sets, run light boards, do sound design, pick out the right costumes, how to do their hair and makeup, all with incredibly precise timing. He taught us the history of the theater. And for me particularly, he fostered a sense of interest in fashion history, hair and makeup and design. I still use all of these things in my life today. I have to do a lot of public speaking for my job, and without the skills that I learned from Hank, I would not be as confident in that role. I think of Hank and what I've learned from him almost every single day. Like a sports coach, Hank gave us drills, running lines, catching cues, practicing blocking, helped us connect with our physical bodies, breath work, pratfalls, speaking to the back row, showed us ways to cope when the things go wrong, ad-libs, covering for lost lines, and most importantly, supported us by coaching us how to work together to make it all happen. I still value that Hank would not cast somebody if they hadn't put time in on the crew. He knew you couldn't just walk onto the stage and be a star, that you had to put the work in behind the scenes as well. Generations of students who may not have been sporty kids learned from Hank how to work as a team. Not only that, we were good. If theater had been a competitive sport, we would have been state champions. Naming the new auditorium after Hank would be an honor, akin to naming a stadium after a beloved coach. And that is an honor he very much deserves. Many thanks for your time. From Heather Alexander, who is executive producer of Audible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judy. Ed Hendrickson?
Hello, I'm Ed Hendrickson. I live at 1920 Paulson Drive, and I graduated in 1974 from Ames High School. I'm reading a letter from Andy Stevenson. He graduated in 1992, but he's a friend of mine, former colleague at Engineering Animation, and he's now a software architect in Minneapolis. So we're both geeks. So this is from Andy. To the Ames Community School Board, I'm writing in support of naming the new AHS auditorium in honor of Wayne Hank Hansen. When my family moved to Iowa in January of 1989, I was midway through my 9th grade year, looking for ways to meet genuinely nice and accepting friends in my new home. On a bus ride home from a school trip, I was invited to come to the crew, he's got that in quotes, on Saturday. No need to worry about prior experience. When I arrived the next Saturday, Hank greeted me and set me up with a group. I was surprised at the large number of kids helping out, many that weren't even performing in the show. By the end of the morning, I was certain I would enjoy returning and building friendships within this group. One thing that really struck me about Hank's approach to theater at AHS was that so many different types of kids felt welcome and included in both crew and the shows themselves. I returned for many subsequent shows, and the kids involved always varied and spanned the typical social groups of normal classrooms. I eventually acted on stage, to my own surprise, joined Thespians, and co-directed a senior one act. My comfort in speaking to groups of people certainly originated with Hank. Looking back upon these fond memories with Hank and his influence within this special environment, it really struck me how he established a sense of community where a wide range of kids were welcomed, empowered, and trusted in the Ames High Theater program. While many theater programs include the art kids or choir kids, Hank somehow created a safe place for a much more diverse collection of students to feel comfortable and included. Particularly because I arrived in Ames from another state, it was a pleasant experience to find so many different students being welcomed by Hank. This was not the experience at my former school. only a small group of students were involved. I've witnessed that unfortunate pattern in some high schools today as well. The number of kids involved is smaller and does not pull in from such a great cross-section of the student population. My impression remains today that a special environment was created and nourished by Hank within Ames High School, and that is noteworthy of remembrance. And as an aside, I want to let you know that Andy also is not only a geek, he plays guitar in a rock band. And in the past, he worked on sound recordings, and he recorded and produced a CD of songs sung by the late Tom Jorgensen, who was an Ames High math teacher and coach. Oh, and also my father was on that CD. So that's just personal experience. So thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Victoria Van Boris.
Good evening. I'm wearing my 1960s version of the Ames High athletic booster pin, so it was my father's, not mine. But I'm here also to read another letter in support of naming the new Ames High Auditorium after Wayne Hansen. This is from Jennifer Johnson, who was the class of 1995. To the Ames Community School Board and Facilities Committee, I am writing in support of naming the new AHS auditorium Wayne Hansen Auditorium. I was a speech student of Mr. Hansen and also participated as an actor in one-act plays my senior year at Ames High, where Mr. Hansen was a consistent supporter, mentor, and cheerleader to student participants. What I remember most about Mr. Hansen was his uncanny ability to make every single student at Ames High feel valued, supported, and heard. Speech as a subject can cause students to feel nervous or insecure as they practice a craft that is deeply important, but also anxiety-provoking. More people fear speaking in public than death. Mr. Hansen was the perfect shepherd for speech class, both in terms of breaking down the process to make it more accessible for everyone, and for creating a safe and welcoming learning container. As a teacher, Mr. Hansen brought his whole self, humor, uniqueness, and genuine love for students and teaching. Outside of the classroom, he spent thousands of hours supporting the theater program at Ames High. I got a small glimpse into his contributions when I participated in one-act plays my senior year. Mr. Hansen was at every practice and performance, supporting students and helping to troubleshoot any technical or other problems we faced. He was the kind of person who looked out for everybody, but especially for students who may have found themselves on the margins. He was the kind of person who earned trust by showing up for students every day. Naming the new Ames High School auditorium after Mr. Hansen is truly a nod to one of the highest values in the Ames public education: inclusion, creativity, community, and contribution. I hope you will honor him and his legacy by naming the auditorium Wayne Hansen Auditorium. Thank you for your consideration. Sincerely, Dr. Jennifer J. Johnson, Director of Student Leadership, Involvement, and Community Engagement, Colorado State University, Fort Collins.
And we do not have anyone signed up to speak via Zoom, so I will go ahead and close our public forum and we'll move on to our consent items, and I'll entertain a motion.
I move approval of items as presented.
Second.
Moved by Franson, seconded by Winfrey. Superintendent Lawson, gifts to the district.
Yes, this evening, we'd like to extend a thanks to several donors for their very generous gifts. First, we have Trade Home Shoes, who donated 52 pairs of shoes, a $2,600 value for the benefit of Edwards Elementary. Next, we have Whitney Judas, who donated a flute and trumpet, $600 value for the benefit of the Ames Middle School Band. And lastly, but certainly not least, we have Jen Shares, who donated $9.95 to the Lunch Hero program. So,
Thank
yeah,
you.
thank you.
All right, it's moved by Franzen, seconded by Winfrey to accept the consent items. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Passes 7-0. Moving on to our action items. First, we have our policies for action.
I move the board approve the policies as presented.
Second.
Moved by Winfrey, seconded by Franzen. Discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Passes 7-0. The 2022-23 retirement incentives for employees.
I move the board approve the 2022-23 retirement incentives for employees as presented.
Second.
Moved by Linkaitis, seconded by Beerbaum. Discussion? All those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Passes 7-0. New Ames High School construction project bid issuance number 4.
I move the board award the contract for bid issuance number 4, bid package number 6-2, west site improvements to Grabau Construction Company in the amount of $2,309,900.
Second.
Moved by Beerbaum, seconded by Franzen. Discussion? All those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Passes 7-0. Moving on to our student representative board and staff items. We don't have our student representatives with us this evening, so we will move on to our items from the board. And beginning with requests from staff, what I had for this evening would be a data cycle relating to the instructional improvement strategies, and additional information throughout the year to kind of understand how things are going on a more frequent basis rather than just looking at the ISASP results. Does that sound?
Yeah, and I think there might be some overlap with that with the work session coming up that Dr. Lawson wants to talk to us about kind of the big goals of the district. So I anticipate they'll be connected.
Yep.
I didn't have any other items for staff. Okay. Other items from the board? Okay. Items from the superintendent?
No items from the superintendent.
Okay. Then we will go to our board planning calendar. And we are going to probably have a little discussion around this one tonight. So we have our regular meetings, our next meeting scheduled for November 7th, which will also include, right now it's scheduled to include our annual meeting as well as a work session. And I think we have 3 board members who will not be present that evening. So I don't think we'll be able to have our annual meeting on November 7th. So I had asked some folks earlier, but is there anyone who will not be available? Well, Brett, you said you would not be available on November 21st. Okay. Are there other folks who will be gone on November 21st for that meeting? Sorry, go ahead. Take your time.
It's the Monday before Thanksgiving. if that
Yeah, it's
helps.
the Monday of the week of Thanksgiving.
No, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay. And then my other question would be, would anyone object to or be unavailable for a meeting on November 14th? Is that an evening that would work for folks?
An additional meeting?
Well, no, it would probably, we would move one of these
One of them.
to the 14th.
Instead of the 21st.
Yeah, or instead of the 7th or something. Or combine them. That seems unlikely because I think it'd be too much for one
I'm
meeting.
available the 14th.
You're available the 14th. That's the week of IASB, but
I'm hesitantly available.
do you leave Tuesday morning?
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought.
But if it's not a double meeting, but if we need to
If we
do,
could do
Yeah.
like the annual meeting or something. Okay. All right, so everyone will be available on the 14th. Okay, so JD, we'll chat and figure out what'll be best. So, okay. Anything else on the board planning calendar? All right, I will entertain a
I
motion.
move we adjourn.
Second. Moved by Beerbaum, seconded by Smith. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Passes 7-0. Thank you.